All right. So we are still in the middle of a lecture series, but as I've said to you before, I will, from time to time, interrupt the series in order to talk about world events, big things in the news, interesting developments that seem to demand our attention. And of course, yesterday marked the anniversary, the beginning of the second year of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And so I think it might be a good opportunity to reflect on this for a little while. I'm not sure I've got a full hour's worth of stuff to say to you, so we'll see how the discussion unfolds. And if not, we can go back to the lecture. But the usual series on the lifespan revolution, justice, care, and ethics. But having said that, I do think that there's greater clarity today about the nature of the unfolding aggression in the Ukraine by the Russians than there has been for perhaps the much of the first year of the war. And what I see, and I don't think I'm alone, I don't think I'm original in seeing this, is a long-term grinding conflict, right? And so it seems to me that the Russians, despite their clear numeric and weapon superiority, do not have the discipline, the organization, the morale to really make significant advances. And unless they develop an entirely different strategy and an entirely thus far lacking capacity to execute that strategy, I don't think the Russians are likely to turn the tide of the war in their favor in a dramatic way in the coming year. And having said that, I also don't think the Ukrainians, although they have shown tremendous resolve, incredible bravery, and I think quite stunning capacity to prevent the Russians from rapidly advancing and decapitating their government and taking half of their country, and then since then growing military prowess shown in their rapid advances last fall and in their ongoing ability to resist the Russian effort to advance and in fact efforts to regain some of the occupied territory. But again, unless I don't think this is likely, the world or the countries, the 17 countries arming the Ukraine to be precise, gives them dramatically different weaponry, or unless there's a regime change or a total avant-garde in Russia, that the Ukrainians are going to be able to accomplish the goal that Vladimir Zelensky has made the national rallying call in the Ukraine of the complete expulsion of Russians from Ukrainian territory, including from the Crimea. And I want to be as clear as possible. Part of the reason I don't think that's realistic is not only does the Ukrainian army or military lack the weapons and capacity to bring that about, especially in light of the overwhelming numeric advantage that the Russians hold. But it is also the case that outcome would be lethal to the regime of Vladimir Putin. And Putin clearly recognizes this, and so will do everything in his power to resist being routed and completely evicted from Ukrainian territory. And his power includes an arsenal filled with nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. And I don't think that we're at grave, imminent risk for that kind of escalation. But I do think that probably before he completely surrenders his ambition for the Ukraine, Vladimir Putin would have recourse to those kinds of weapons. And so with that framework in mind, this is a stalemate, perhaps not a complete standoff in the sense that each side may make minor advances. It's not a war that will be resolved through decisive victory of one side or the other. at any point soon. And so we have to recognize and plan for a long-term grinding war. And I do think that that should lead us to see this alternative between an potentially endless war. Literally everything in human history ends, but a war that, in terms of our time frame, goes on and on and on, or thinking in terms of an end game that is not a Ukrainian victory, is not a Russian victory, but some sort of brokered exit from war that allows both sides to claim sufficient victory to allow them to stand down and uh, draw up some sort of treaty. And I don't think that there's enough discussion of that right now. And so that is where I'd like us to spend a little bit of time thinking today. I will try to provide some background information, and I'm going to start with what I consider to be kind of the central pieces in the puzzle here. Right, this is the beginning of the second year of the invasion. As I was coming online, my telephone lit up with a new article from the New York Times about the partnership between Biden and Zelensky. I have not seen it, but obviously last week, Joe Biden made a surprise visit to Kyiv to underline the United States support for the Ukrainian government and its leader, and to try to boost the morale of the Ukrainian people. And I would, in a sense, focus on a different dyad in this conflict, and that is the relationship between Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden. And here, I think, in a sense, this is a perfect mismatch in terms of the mindset of those two leaders and the mutual mistrust, hostility, animosity, but also the world views, the values, and the idea that Joe Biden, who comes out of a 20th century foreign policy framework, a framework that sees appeasement as always destructive, always licensing further aggression, that sees this as a struggle for values between democracy and autocracy, and therefore is recalcitrant in his support for the Ukraine. And on the other hand, Vladimir Putin, who still thinks of Russia as a great power and thinks of the United States as having been completely disrespectful of Russian status over the last 40 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and who, one of the descriptions that I've heard of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine that I especially like is that Putin wants a new Yalta. He wants a new negotiation of European power relations that recognizes Russia as one of the main European and world powers, and that part of invading the Ukraine is to say to the US and the world, you cannot bully Russia anymore. We will do what we want in our own backyard, right? And so thinking about the personalities of the leaders involved, I think, is important to recognizing why it is unlikely that we're going to have a rapid diplomatic breakthrough here. Then, additionally, there's the map. And this is an overall map of the Ukraine, which indicates that Russia now controls about 80% of the territory of the Donbass, that the Ukrainians have made some advances in pushing Russia out of some of the territory that it controlled, particularly in and around Kherson in the northwest of the Donbass, and in and around the area by Zaporizhzhia and Melitopol in the southwestern region of the Donbass. And on the other hand, clearly Russia still controls the majority of the Donbass, and this map indicates possible battlefronts for the coming year as the winter begins to release the troops from their relatively dug in positions after the thaw, after the mud season, then presumably there will be room for new offensives on both sides. I'm noticing, give me a second here. It appears, am I right, that I'm freezing a little bit on in my broadcast? Are you getting interruptions? No, it's smooth. It's clear. Okay, I was just coming out to check my internet connection. I am on the right internet connection. Please, somebody say something. Just the best thing is to put it in the chat if there's any problems with my transmission. Okay. Um, So I'm going to keep going, but as always, whenever you have a question or a comment, please just raise your hand or unmute yourself and let me know. So the third diagram here, and I know it's too small to make out. I'm going to show you a bigger version of it in a moment. But this is the diagram that shows where Ukrainian support is coming from in terms of the influx of weapons and aid to the Ukraine. And I think it's absolutely clear that the Ukraine at this point is not capable of fighting this war without substantial outside assistance. It's not capable of maintaining minimal economic viability without substantial outside assistance. And what this diagram shows is the countries supporting the Ukraine. And I want to be, as clear, given how small it is, about what it reveals, which is that there are only 17 countries in the world that are making substantial military and financial contributions to the Ukraine. And that's a small and fragile coalition, right? And so I think another big question, in addition to what happens on the ground in the Ukraine, is what happens diplomatically with the coalition currently supporting the Ukraine. And clearly, Putin's strategy, in part in hoping that this war will drag on, will become increasingly obviously a long-term stalemate, is that he can fracture the coalition supporting the Ukraine, or that the inflation, the food shortages, the other strains on the global economy and global diplomacy that this war is generating will ultimately undermine domestic support for continued assistance to the Ukraine in the 17 countries that are instrumental to supporting it. And here it's worthwhile noting, of course, that the United States has a national election in less than 2 years, and that some of the leading candidates for the Republicans are much less likely to continue the level of support of the aggressive diplomacy of the Biden administration to sustain this coalition and sustain support for the Ukraine. Um, these are old maps. I'm just trying to give you a sense of the way in which this invasion began a year ago, right? And so this is a map from March 2nd of 2022, in which, as you can see, the Russian blitzkrieg has resulted in Russia controlling not only considerable territories in the Donbass and in the south east of the Ukraine, but also, right, getting very close to Kyiv, taking or getting to basically the area immediately surrounding Kharkiv. And I think the ambition and the likely outcome, as far as most analysts were concerned in those first few weeks of the war, was that Russia would actually perhaps be able to make it to Odessa in the south, Kyiv in the north, and then create a line between the two of them, controlling at least half of the Ukraine. And as you can see, the area controlled by Russia has consistently shrunk over the intervening year. And it does appear that Russian ambitions have really been restricted to simply controlling the Donbass, which is a substantial and mineral rich and industrial region of the Ukraine. That's no small ambition, but it's much smaller than the ambition of essentially controlling half or more of the country, the entire eastern half, and toppling and decapitating the government. Um, and as Russian ambitions have shrunk, Ukrainian ambitions have grown. If we take Vladimir Zelensky at face value, the rallying call for the Ukrainians at this point is to completely evict Russians from Ukrainian held territory. And that includes not only the Donbass, but also the Crimea, which Russia has held since 2014, and in which their troops and facilities are deeply entrenched. And this then, I think, indicates, right, why this is likely a long war. The Russians cannot accomplish their objectives. It doesn't appear to me that they have the capacity, but because the Ukrainian objectives have grown, it is also hard to envision the scenario in which they are going to succeed. And so, as opposed to either side being able to deliver a knockout blow, I am convinced by the analysis I read that this is going to likely be a long, grinding, awful war continuing for another year or years. So if we then just spend a moment thinking about what Russia wants to accomplish in the spring and the coming year, we see it already trying to advance on several fronts in the Donbass. And if you can make it out, the gray area on this map or the darker tan area on this map, that's the remaining territory of the Donbass that Russia doesn't control. And if it could advance simultaneously from the north and the south in a so-called pincer movement, it could cut off the remaining Ukrainian troops from resupply and then consolidate control over the entire Donbass region. But one of the things to notice is that these initial exploratory attacks that have occurred over the last month have been a disaster for the Russians. That tens of thousands of more casualties have resulted, that it appears two brigades have been effectively decimated, that tanks and troop carriers and artillery have been destroyed in these efforts. And so one of the things that observers are noting is that the Russians do not seem to be learning from previous mistakes, that their strategy seems to be exactly what it was, that they're repeating the mistakes in terms of advancing tanks and artillery in open territory where they are easily picked off by the Ukrainians. And that the strategy here appears to be to ultimately deplete the Ukraine of both artillery, shells in particular, and of people and of the will to fight. And I don't know. It doesn't seem like a very sound military strategy to me, in the sense that it involves feeding tens or hundreds of thousands of young Russian lives to Ukrainian artillery and machine guns in order to eventually exhaust the Ukrainian capacity to fight. And so that does, I think, help to bring into focus part of the barbarism, the inhumanity of Vladimir Putin's strategy here, that he does not care about sacrificing perhaps a generation of young Russian men to his ambition, sacrificing them on the altar of his megalomania. He wants to be seen in the line of Peter the Great as the Russian leader who extended the Russian control and restored Russia as a great power and territorial force within Eastern Europe. And it doesn't matter to him that the cost of doing so is hundreds of thousands of Russian casualties. Having said that, as I've tried to emphasize with you in previous discussions of this, modern warfare is in many respects different from the warfare of the middle of the 20th century, in which the Russians were able ultimately to repulse the Nazi invasion just through the sheer advantage of numbers and the willingness to feed their troops into the meat grinder of the battles. Because,
Excuse me, David.
yeah, go ahead.
It's not just the Russian population that he's decimating. He's deliberately targeting, in the cruelest way possible, the civilian population in Ukraine. And I don't know how long these people can withstand what he's been doing to them, but it's just hideous.
Yes, it is. And so whether you're talking about the all but indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets, right? The use of illegal munitions in targeting civilian areas, cluster bombs and explosive devices that permeate civilian structures with gas and then detonate, or else also the targeting of the electrical supply, the heating infrastructure, trying to cow the Ukrainian population by making life so miserable for them that they eventually surrender or lose the capacity, the willingness to fight. This strategy does not appear to me to be succeeding. It's succeeding in creating death and misery, no doubt. It's awful. It's inhumane, it's barbaric, but it's not reducing the Ukrainian willingness to fight. And again, I think that there's either lack of sufficient and reliable information in Vladimir Putin's decision making, and if he thinks that this strategy can succeed, or else we are misjudging what he considers in his calculus, that where this strategy is succeeding is not in reducing the resolve of the Ukraine, but in a sense in placating the people on the hard far right, the hawks in Russia, who want to see some military success. And if he can keep them from rebelling, then he's also apparently succeeding in consolidating and strengthening his rule in Russia, in part because Western companies are withdrawing and the liberals in Russia are fleeing or on the retreat. The level of state repression has increased from what was already quite extreme into the realm of borderline totalitarian control. And so in those regards, yes, absolutely, the Ukrainian people are suffering awfully, as are the Russian conscripts, some of whom are taken straight out of jail cells and thrown onto the front lines with insufficient training, insufficient arms, insufficient support, and commanders who will kill them if they attempt to retreat, disobey orders, or try to defect, right? And so I think we have to be clear-eyed about the enormity of the evil and barbarism of Vladimir Putin's conduct of this war and of his regime. Having said all of that, as you may gather from the title, my tact today, which is different from where it has been for most of the last year, is to say that the appropriate response is not simply to continue to endlessly support the Ukrainians in fighting this war. And I want to gradually explain to you why that is as well. Any other thoughts or questions before I get back into the slides? And thank you, Wilma, for that remark. And please keep them coming if you have them.
Yes, it's Birgit.
Yes,
I have heard that the Ukrainians are using ammunition in using a month's supply what takes a year to produce. Can you, do you know any more about that? And will the countries supporting Ukraine be able to continue supplying enough in that time?
Yeah, so I'm not expert in this, but I'll tell you what I have learned from the research I'm doing, and I think it's absolutely clear that whether we're talking about troops or artillery, other forms of munition, there is a deep asymmetry between what Russia can do and what the Ukraine can do. And part of my understanding of the evolving strategy of the Ukrainians and their allies is to try to figure out how the Ukrainians can fight while using less artillery, because they are running out of shells. And I do think that the ratio tends to still be 10-1 Russian to Ukrainian actual shells fired, right? So it's actually quite remarkable that the Ukrainians have held and actually advanced in terms of repelling the Russians, given the sheer numerical advantage that the Russians have. But having said that, part of what is happening in the current moment is that the Ukrainians are being resupplied not just with shells, but with new weapons, right?
Yeah.
And so the HIMARS, the tanks that they will be getting from Germany and the United States, the question of when, and there were strikes a week ago further into Russian territory than anyone understood their current capacity to allow them to strike. And so do they have new weapons? Are they repurposing drones or other weapons? I'm not sure, based on what's happened for the last year, that the steep numerical advantage that the Russians have mean that the Ukrainians are simply going to run out, or that they are going to eventually hit up against a wall in which they are no longer able to continue to fight the Russians because they've run out. Clearly, this is part of the Russian strategy. So far, it has not succeeded. And that, in fact, I think reflects the fact that the Ukrainian strategy on the ground, right, is much more nimble and relies on greater decentralization, but also greater courage, resolve, willingness to fight, and greater understanding of how to use high-tech weapons than the Russians have. And so in some sense, the Ukrainians are compensating for their obvious numerical inferiority with the advantages that they do have. And so far, that has held up. I don't know enough to know whether there's an end in sight for that, but nothing I'm looking at says, the Ukrainians are months from exhausting their capacity to continue this strategy. Anyone else with thoughts or comments before I go back to the slides? All right, so I'm going to go back in and keep the questions coming. We've been looking at the areas where Russia is trying to advance and what a rational strategy, if they can actually execute it, for moving a pincer attack into the remainder of the Donbass would look like. I have to say, given the failures of these probing attacks, I'm skeptical of the Russians' capacity to mount a more ambitious and difficult attack, but the months ahead will tell. When we look at the Ukrainians and what I was actually just saying in response to Birgit's question, right? This map shows the range of Ukrainian weapons into Russian territory, right? And this is relevant because the Russians have been forced, in light of new weapons supplied by primarily the Americans, us, to the Ukrainians, to position their munitions dumps and supply chains and command structures further outside of the territory. And this is making it more difficult for them to maintain their supply lines and to conduct their strategy. If the Ukrainians continue to extend this band, it's going to make it all the more difficult. As you can see, the Ukrainians can relatively easily, move their troops and supplies along the entire front of the contested territory. The Russians have to have two separate supply lines from the Crimea for their troops in the south and from Russia itself for their troops in the north. It appears that the Ukrainian strategy will be to try to advance in the southeast of their own country, to advance in particular on Melitopol, and then if they're successful in advancing, to then push outwards. And what that would do would be to essentially split the territory that the Russians control into two, to make it much more difficult to resupply the area in the southeast, in the Donbass, to make it exclusively reliant on Crimean supplies. You probably remember that Crimea is connected to Russia via a long bridge, and that bridge creates both a choke point and a vulnerability for resupply. This could both make these troops' lives more difficult and demoralizing, knowing that they're cut off from supply from Russia. So those are the likely battle lines in the coming months. I'm not going to focus there any further unless you have questions. What I want to focus on a little bit more now is diplomacy. And here is where I really want to suggest that we need to start thinking a little bit more about the consequences for this war beyond the borders of the Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. As brutal and awful as this war is, it is not only the Ukrainians who are suffering from it. And in the first instance, everyone around the world is suffering from inflation, and that may get worse. And it's not this war alone that is causing it, but this war and what it is doing to energy prices is clearly contributing to it and making it more difficult to bring inflation under control. And you only have to look back about 50 years in history to recognize that once inflation really takes hold, it can be very destructive for global economic activity. And then we add to that the way in which this war has affected food prices as well as other commodity prices on a global scale, that in particular, the poorer regions of the world, areas in Africa that are also suffering from drought, probably related to climate change, are now no longer able to import Ukrainian wheat, which had been a staple for them. And so this war is fracturing the world and straining the world in ways that are broader than the immediate theater of conflict. You may have heard the G20 summit, which took place in India, just concluded, and it concluded without a communique, without a shared statement from the 20 countries participating in it. And the roadblock that kept them from issuing any joint statement was precisely the war in the Ukraine, and the United States and allies demanding that the G20 condemn the Russian invasion and its continuation, and the Russians and the Chinese resisting that and refusing to sign any document. And this is, I think, just the most recent sign that we are drifting into greater international tension, diminished international cooperation, and that this war, as awful as it is is creating all kinds of ripple effects that threaten international diplomacy and cooperation at a moment where it is absolutely essential, imperative that we begin to figure out how to cooperate with countries that we disdain, that we don't like, whose policies we find repugnant. And if this war is, if we maintain our current course, going to continue year after year, then that damage is going to grow worse, and our room for maneuver, our time for maneuver, is going to run out if we aren't careful. So now looking more precisely at the diplomacy surrounding the conflict here, I can't tell. Do I have a comment? I'm sorry, my computer was reconfigured recently, and I get peculiar um, lights that I have no idea what they mean, but I guess I don't have a comment right now. What I will point out to you is that at the beginning of the war, many of the world's most advanced countries reduced or severed economic relations with Russia, right? And so the idea that there was a counterstrike on Russia that was an economic war to counter its military war, I think is real and has been damaging to the Russian economy. Having said that, I think it is also the case that it was uneven. So as you can see here, right, there are I believe it's ultimately nearly 40 countries that have severed or reduced their economic relations with Russia as a result of the invasion. And you may have noticed both the European Union and the United States announced new economic sanctions on the 1-year anniversary of the war. So we're continuing to try to apply pressure on Russia. But having said that, there are also a large number of countries that have, in fact, increased their trade with Russia. And some of them, India, China, for instance, are very large markets and large economies. And the result is that Russia is today almost back to the level of trade that it was at in the pre-invasion phase of its economy, and that its export revenue has in fact regained all of the lost territory, in part because the invasion increased the price of their number one export commodity, oil, right? The other diagram I want you to spend a moment with, and this is the one I showed at the very outset, but now I hope it's a little bigger and you can make it out. These are the countries supporting the Ukraine. And there are 5 categories here, right? And so the question is, have countries condemned Russia, given weapons, and given substantial financial assistance to the Ukraine, where that's measured as at least 0.1% of GDP? And the 17 countries in the center here meet those criteria. The other countries, and so there are some countries that have sent weapons, but not enough or sufficient financial aid to put them in this category. So for instance, France, Spain, Italy, although they've sent some weapons, not considerable. Some countries that have given financial assistance, but not weapons, Japan, for instance. Some that have given military assistance, but not imposed sanctions. So Turkey is one of those countries, right? South Korea is another. And then some countries that have imposed sanctions, but not given military aid. The point I'm making in focusing on this diagram is that the Ukraine is very much dependent on these 17 countries. And the alliance here, I think, is fragile and likely to become more fragile as the war drags on. And so even from a purely pragmatic point of view, the idea that we would just stay the course and for the next year and the year after that, continue to rely on all of these countries maintaining sanctions against Russia, providing military and financial aid to the Ukraine. And the Ukraine at this point absolutely cannot conduct this war, cannot sustain its economy with that aid, I think requires a really concerted diplomatic effort. And so two things to say about that. The countries trying to sustain that effort, like the United States, perhaps Germany, certainly the United Kingdom, have limited diplomatic bandwidth. And so what we do to sustain the coalition supporting the Ukraine is going to exhaust our diplomatic energies, or at least distract from other things that in the long term may be actually more important, more significant long-term interests. And then the other thing to notice is, right, the United States has an election coming up in less than 2 years. It may be that part of Putin's strategy here is to wait out those elections, to try to influence those elections, to hope that his aggression actually has an influence on those elections, perhaps in the form of inflation, or perhaps that he will, again, using social media conduits, be able to influence the outcome of that election. And 2 years from now, there will be a different president who will be either less inclined or less capable of sustaining this coalition, right? So again, I think even if we're just focused on the Ukraine, we have to be cognizant of the fact that the current strategy has worked for a year, but may not be able to succeed if this turns into a long, grinding war. Having said that, I also want to call attention to the fact that the American perspective on this invasion is not the only way to view it. I've shown you this before. I know that if we look at the number of countries who voted to condemn Russia for invading the Ukraine, it sounds like a lot, 140, right? But if we look at the size of the population that they represent, it's only about 40% of the world's population. The countries that did not vote to condemn Russia, in fact, represent the majority of the world's population. And why is that? I don't think it's necessarily because India thinks it's a good thing that Russia invaded the Ukraine, but I do think India values its trading relationship with Russia, its supply to Russian oil, more than it values the norm of territorial integrity in this case. Or, to put it differently, that India and many other countries are saying, wait a sec, there's all this moral outrage now, but what about when the United States invaded Afghanistan or Iraq or intervened in wars in Yugoslavia and Libya and Syria, right? And we could obviously keep going. That this does not seem to be a norm that is universally respected, irrespective of who's violating it, but it's a norm that's used by the strongest countries in the world to try to limit the freedom of the weaker countries in the world. And then when we look at the distribution of wealth and the origins of climate emissions, I think countries like India and China say, well, this is interesting. So the United States cares so much about the Ukraine that they're willing to shell out billions of dollars to aid them, give them their most advanced weapons, make this the focus of their diplomacy. what about climate change? What about the demand of the poorer countries in the world for the better part of a decade now, that they receive assistance from the countries that have put most of the heat trapping gases into the atmosphere? They seem to be much less generous, much less focused and forceful when it comes to those things that are actually the most important, or should be the most important, to us. So I think we have to take into account that it's not just a calculation of interest. It's also a consideration of what seem to be the actual guiding principles of American foreign policy, and the fact that they reflect what, from the perspective of many other countries in the world, is peculiar priorities. To turn to those priorities now, and I want to really focus on climate change here for a minute or two. I suppose you won't be surprised to hear that. But not only climate change, what I've referred to you in the past as the vulnerability of the planet as a whole. And this is then the planetary boundaries framework developed by Will Stefan and Professor Rockstrom, a European climate scientist, and their suggestion that the planet as a whole has become much more vulnerable to ecological catastrophe over the last 150 years. And that if we try to use cutting edge science to isolate the different paths of risk for global ecological catastrophe, there are perhaps at least 9 different planetary systems that sustain the planet in a place where it's supportive of the range of biological life we now have on the planet. And 6 of those 9 systems is currently threatened by human activity, right? And the reason to emphasize that we have moved from being a resilient to being a fragile planet, a vulnerable planet. And I think it's a peculiar thing to even say. What do you mean the planet is fragile and vulnerable? It's this huge, vast rock circling the sun. How could it be vulnerable? Well, it is vulnerable in terms of its continued capacity to sustain the range of biological life that it currently sustains. And by the way, that includes us. And the reason I emphasize this in this context, I hope it's obvious, is that we cannot solve the problems. We cannot address the unfolding processes that we have unleashed, but that we are unlikely to be able to control if they continue to advance, that may pretty soon become self-reinforcing, runaway processes. We cannot address these problems without sustained international cooperation. We need China. We need India to work with us if we are going to avoid global catastrophe. Richard Haas, the head of the Foreign Relations Council, in the comments, an interview he gave at the anniversary of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, said the history of the 21st century is not going to turn on who controls the Donbass. And I think that's absolutely right. We don't want to appease aggression. We don't want to reward Vladimir Putin's barbarism. We want to stand up for the Ukrainians who are being bullied, butchered, and raped by the Russians. And yet we also have to put in the scale that our efforts to support the Ukrainians may be undermining our capacity to address planetary catastrophe. And I think when we put those two things in the scale obviously tilts very heavily in favor of avoiding climate change, of avoiding other forms of catastrophic planetary risk. And just to be as clear as possible about this, we are very far away from where we need to be, right? This is the trajectory of heat trapping gases, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And as you can see, right, we're doing better now than we were doing at the beginning of the century. But current policies and action do not get us to the place where we contain climate change to 1.5 degrees Celsius. To take just a simple example, if we stay at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will see substantial die-offs in coral reefs. But if we go where we are right now, the coral reefs will go completely extinct. Coral as a species will go completely extinct. And what that does to the oceans, what it does to biodiversity of marine life, we have no idea. And the Earth is completely dependent on the biodiversity of the oceans in sustaining our oxygen supply, right? And so we need to recognize at the moment, one of the reasons we're falling so short of our goals is because of Chinese emissions. And it's not them alone. Historically, we've been much worse, but at present, China is the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And we need to be able to work with them. We need to not only be able to work with them, but to assist them, to cooperate, to collaborate on identifying other paths to modernization that don't involve planetary destruction, or at least risk it. And by the way, China, as the second largest economy in the world, soon to be the largest economy in the world, as the most populous nation in the world, as the emerging superpower that we have to recognize is increasingly influential, not only in its own large territory and over its own sizable population, but everywhere else in the world. We have to work with them, not only on getting their own emissions under control, but on a global scale, bringing these processes under control. And to be as clear as possible, and I will conclude here, there was some important research that was announced just a week ago. I'm not sure whether you saw this, but this is the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica. This is Antarctica here, right? And that's the location of this glacier. To give you a sense of the scale, that glacier is more than a mile thick. And this is a image of a submersible that was put under that glacier, right? This is not literally the underside of the glacier, but you can see the little hole there where they dropped the submersible through. And it took them the better part of a decade to do this research, to drill a hole through a mile thick glacier and be able to see the underside of it. And the reason this is so important, I think many of us got our first exposure to the idea that heating the planet through the greenhouse effect threatened the polar ice caps. That our first exposure to that idea was from Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth. And the model that was the dominant model, the best science at the time, showed the glaciers melting from the top, right? The heated atmosphere of the planet created melting conditions. Maybe there would be fissures, maybe some water would then get deeper into the glaciers. Since then, and this is, I think, a lesson in humility about how we really don't understand the processes that we're unleashing until we begin to measure the damage they're doing and to recognize, oh goodness, the damage is unfolding much more quickly and in different ways and with different chains of interconnection than we realized. Well, with the glaciers and the ice sheets and the ice caps, it appears that they are actually melting more quickly from the bottom than from the top. And the reason I think we've talked about this together before has to do with changes in global ocean currents that are bringing, and by the way, changes in energy in the global vortex, the polar vortex, bringing warm water underneath the glaciers more quickly. And what we learned, and I think it's actually very important to recognize that there's both good news and bad news in figuring out how this works, is on the one hand, there appears to be a cushion of colder and denser water immediately underneath the glaciers that is protecting it a little bit from the influx of warm water that climate change is producing. But on the other hand, if there is a fissure or uneven terraced texture to the bottom of the glacier, that allows the warmer water to mix with that barrier layer of highly salinated water. And then the glacier no longer has its protective layer. All of that to say, right? The other name for the Thwaites Glacier is the Doomsday Glacier. The reason it's called that is because it essentially acts like a cork in keeping a vast ice sheet from making its way to the sea. To give you a sense of the scale here, right? This is Antarctica. Antarctica is the 5th largest continent on the planet. It is larger than Europe. So that's the size of this ice cap. It's a huge white umbrella raised at the pole of the planet. If this glacier loses its integrity and it is deteriorating very quickly, then the cork comes out of the bottom. Then it no longer prevents this vast ice sheet, the size of the state of Florida, from making its way to the sea. That ice sheet collapses, makes its way to the sea. It's a long process, but the result of the process, it may take 1,000 years, is that a substantial tear in that umbrella that currently protects the globe from heating up will be opened. And the result may be that the planet starts accelerating its heating process in a way that we have no good way of controlling. And so let me just be blunt about this, right? When we look at the prospects for runaway climate change, right? For a planet that heats 2 or 3 degrees Celsius over the next 100 years, we're talking about 1 billion climate refugees. That's both the UN and the US military's estimate. We're talking about the collapse not only of governments, but perhaps of whole civilizations in large regions of the world, in Africa, in China, in Latin America, etc. And so, as important as it is not to appease Putin's aggression, as important as it is to stand up for the Ukrainians who are being so brutalized, I think we also have to recognize that one long-term consequence of the war in Ukraine dragging on, and increasingly China and the United States being at loggerheads, not just on this issue, but across the board diplomatically, is that we risk global catastrophe. And so I think, and if you want, I can talk about this. I don't have any silver bullet, but I do think that the United States and our allies need to think seriously about how we give both the Ukrainians and the Russians a time frame and face-saving exits from this conflict, because at some point we have to pivot our diplomatic energy to what are more threatening and urgent problems in the world. today. I'll stop there. I imagine I have at least provoked you. I'm not happy with the argument I just made. I am not happy, and you may hear that there's a change. Up until this point, I've been strongly encouraging our foreign policy, or strongly in favor of the approach that the Biden administration has taken of trying to rally the troops to support the Ukraine. But at some point, I think we need to also ask, what are the costs and consequences of simply staying this course? And what are the other interests we realistically need to be pursuing? And are they compatible with staying the course on the Ukraine? I'm increasingly convinced that that's not the case. Who wants to respond to that? Go ahead, John. The hand came up quickly.
It just strikes me as another angle on this, the unanimity of opinion in the newspapers and all we most read about staying the course in Ukraine and how positive their aspects are and all. It's really kind of deafening. The main exceptions I think of are both Stephen Walt and Graham Allison from the Kennedy School at Harvard, who both have been very keen analysis of why we need a realistic rather than an idealistic conception of how foreign policy should work. But it strikes me that one problem we all have is that the only people that are at all doubtful about Ukraine in the United States political, well, in US politics, is the far right.
Yeah.
A lot of Republicans have been raising doubts about, and of course they've been denounced as totally unpatriotic and evil people by everyone, but it's almost the only source of controversy you run into in the mainstream press.
Yeah, and it doesn't do me any good that I find myself on this issue kind of agreeing with the Fox News stance on it, right? But having said that, I do think my grounds are very different from the Fox News grounds, right? I have no sympathy for Putin whatsoever, or for the way in which he's used the war to persecute gays and liberals in his own domestic politics, in the way that I think the Fox News personalities tend to. Having said that, yes, the fact that Richard Haass is saying this, and that's important, because he's not quite as diehard a liberal as some of the people you're mentioning, right? But having said that, yes, it needs to become viable domestically to question this. I suspect it will. I suspect European countries are further along than we are in terms of considering this. But yes, I think this is part of the problem long term with American foreign policy thinking. We like our lines in the sand. We like our enemies. We like our clear-cut bipolar framework in which we know who we're opposed to, and we're going to do everything we can to contain or counter or undermine them. And the world we live in does not sort itself out into those easy compartments anymore. Or the consequence of sorting that world in that way is that we put ourselves on a path that's long-term very self-destructive. Thank you, John. Anybody else with a thought or a question for today? All right. Well, I guess that's where we'll leave these things then. As I said, I intend to continue speaking with you about the lifespan revolution and the political and ethical and policy dimensions that are still left to explore. So with a bit of luck, the world will cooperate, and that's where we'll get back to next week.
David,
Yes,
may I ask you why you're so keen on your assumption that if we don't pursue a vigorous Ukraine policy on the war, we will pursue a vigorous environmental policy for green? It seems to me we have a substantial obstacle in the United States about our green policies.
Yeah, thank you for that. I guess I'm inclined to think that the Biden administration, which may have less than 2 years left, right? And so if it's not the Biden administration, then everything changes, right? But the Biden administration actually was beginning to make this the centerpiece of its foreign policy. I think its recent appointment at the World Bank shows that this continues to be very important, right? And that many of the younger people who are not in the top leadership positions but are in the next rung down recognize the urgency of this problem. Biden got some really important domestic wins, which put the United States in a better position to be more aggressive with climate policy on a global scale, climate diplomacy, I guess I should say. And so having said all of that, you're absolutely right that there's no guarantee that if you know, somehow we find the off-ramp for Russia and the Ukraine, that immediately we pivot back to climate as our top priority. And, you know, I obviously talk with you guys once a week about this stuff. I don't have the ear of any policymakers. I'm just suggesting that from an analytic perspective, right, from where we sit, what we can do, we need to recognize the trade-offs, and that in retrospect, 100 years from now, who controls the Donbass is not going to be nearly as important as whether we've managed to contain global climate change to a tolerable range, or instead we have put ourselves in a position where it's very hard to control and very hard to live. Bonnie, go ahead.
You probably remember better than I do that when Biden was in Poland, he made a speech that really called out Putin. It was as if he wanted a private boxing match. And I just thought, gee, I thought this guy was a slow twitch sort of an athlete, that he was there for the long run. And then he sort of caves to some speechwriter who would like him to have a boxing match with Putin. And how silly is that, to raise the personal stakes in your political arena?
Yeah, and so I think one of the things that we're coping with at the moment is that foreign policy has become much more continuous with domestic politics, much more readily politicized in the 21st century, that during the Cold War there was a kind of gentleman's agreement that domestic politics stops at the country's edge, and that we try to have some sort of consensus in our foreign policy. And as I think unhelpful as Biden's posturing is vis-a-vis Putin, and obviously unhelpful to resolving the conflict in the Ukraine, it may be very helpful to him in terms of his domestic politics. It may be, then I think we may need to concede, or at least entertain the possibility that Biden really believes this, right? That this is part of his deep-seated religious and value perspective, that what Putin is doing is so awful and so wrong that he needs to be called out personally for it. And I happen to have succumbed to that view at points myself. Obviously, I'm not in Biden's position. I can have my animus and disgust without it affecting our foreign policy. But let me just then note that I think even worse, even more destructive, is how the bipartisan consensus issue in American foreign policy right now is being tough on China, right? And that's absolutely what we need to avoid. All right, yes. So thank you for that contribution and for the good point there. Anybody else before we go for today? Thank you so much. Good being with you. And I will see you next Saturday. Couldn't get off the air before I sneezed. All right, everybody. Take care and see you next week. Thanks. Bye-bye.